Can you hear me? Yes, it's working. Everybody welcome. It's a full house, and I think there was a lot of people outside queuing up. My name is Jussi Parikka. I'm from Winchester School of Art, University of Southampton. I'm utterly pleased to be welcoming you all, not only to this panel that we're going to be introducing soon, but I'm going to be kicking off the stream that Winchester School of Art has been in collaboration with Transmediale as one of the supporters and partners curating and planning as a joint venture. Our stream is called Afterglow of the Mediatic, and this is the first event of several that we're going to be presenting over the coming days, today and tomorrow especially, that we created with Professor Ryan Bishop, that you're going to see later as well, but also Transmediale team plus also other people from WUSA. I won't go too much. I'm going to give a couple of words about the stream as a kind of warm-up before we go into the panel and more specifically about big data. But and not too many words because you can read a lot of the kind of statements in the brochures and so forth. Just a couple of words of what do we mean by the stream. In a way, it's kind of easy to summarize by something you see in the foyer and the critical infrastructure project. It's a good summarization of also our stream, and even if it wasn't planned in collaboration directly. It's a mix of geological instruments and conceptual borrowings referring to the natural landscapes and geology together with an analysis of media landscapes and social media culture. What our stream and the panels want to do is make clear and explicate this double bind that media has as technology but also as a framework of knowledge about the Earth and the planetary condition. Basically, media is something reliant on natural resources, minerals and energy. It's about the materiality of media that reminds of that natural formations, whether we're talking about snow, clouds, as in actual clouds, or the Arctic ice, are also registering in concrete chemical forms the history of the planet, an archive of technological forms and pollution, of course. And media also become this informational vector, to use an idea borrowed from Mackenzie Walk. An informational vector that basically itself organizes our relation to the Earth and the planet, and itself becomes a territory, a kind of a milieu, something we're going to be hearing about, itself for mining, and of course data mining I'm talking about. So in this stream, we don't only talk about the Anthropocene, another kind of a hint, towards that one section of the at HKV, but also the Anthropocene. We also talk about the four elements of the pre-Socratics: fire, water, air, earth, and soil, that still define the high-tech scientific cultures in new ways. And we're going to be addressing these through the various panels over the coming days. For instance, after this one, we got Ryan Bishop is moderating the panel, keynote panel, Benjamin Bratton and Meta Haven. Tomorrow we got our fine art group exhibition and other kind of events and panels. But now we're going to be focusing on the informational, even if the topic of big data, of course, would have its climate relations to geophysics. Big data is also about the temperatures and climates and geographical locations of data server farms. So we're going to have papers on artistic, political, and urban context of big data and metadata. And the last thing, there's kind of this notion of uses and abuse of big data. Max might be talking about it as well. Of course, it refers to Friedrich Nietzsche's words, but also it refers to the various contexts and practices where big data is being articulated that we're trying to unravel, and probably ask also whether the concept is even that good. I don't know whether it's going to be in the kind of afterglow sense a hangover from the digital, but might be an intoxicated state of enthusiasm that big data is about still. We'll perhaps unravel it. But I'm going to give it over now to the actual moderator, Max Hoppenstedt, who is the German editor-in-chief for Motherboard, who is also supporting especially this panel. And Motherboard is the online platform for technology, science, and pop culture from the global media company Vice. So, as said, this is co-hosted and supported also by Motherboard. And so I'm going to hand it over to Max next.
Thank you, Jussi. I'm quite pleased to welcome you all and quite pleased to host this panel with the Winchester School of Art and in cooperation with Transmediale, and have three fantastic speakers later on stage who I'm going to introduce in just a minute, actually. Before that, just a few brief words, as I think we had to start a bit late, and there's a has been a big queue, and everybody has organized themselves in the auditorium for the stream, hopefully, as well, to catch what we're doing now. So I'm going to try to be really quick here. So I think the term big data has become a catchphrase at the end of the last decade, I guess, and quickly rose to prominence from performance computing, IT market segment. But it's quite fair to claim, as Christopher and Transmediale team are doing, that it's actually the digital trash of our everyday life now. And everybody's interested in it: secret services, social media corporations, policymakers, scholars of digital humanities, journalists I might want to add to the list. And the notion has always carried with it this term of too big, and as it has been a quick journey from the size that computers can actually calculate to what desktop computers can do now, because what supercomputers used to be able to do a couple of years ago now, and what would render something big data might just be small data now. But also on the other side, brought bold people like whistleblowers and, on the other hand, secret services, what we heard about at the keynote yesterday, have quickly, I think, changed the way we understand how data can render our life politically and socially. So it's definitely not a term to define in a proper sense, but it's more suitable to speak of a history of discourse of big data, even though it has been only a couple of years maybe. And an important starting point, I think, was the term big social data that Lev Manovich coined just in 2011. On another side note, I think we're just around the corner, a couple of days of the 10th anniversary of Facebook, which is probably something that comes immediately to mind when we speak about the social implications of data. And in the, I don't know if you guys have followed it, but I think we all had a short and not so funny laugh at this claim of Princeton that Facebook is going to die in just a couple of years, and the counteraction from Facebook's data attack, actually. So I think the joke there was not on big data itself, obviously, but yeah, it's more of a question of maybe small science dying and big data surviving us. So I'm not sure, but I guess I would tend to the later. But from cloud services like Dropbox changing the way we work to hacker collectives like Telecomics, for whom data has a whole utopian connotation, to actually the data center that gave the visual perspective for the Facebook event of this panel in Utah and the actions against it. It's quite clear that there are geophysical and geopolitical implications to big data and to data. So I think this is the point where we as Motherboard would be interested, because we are not a gadget journalism tech channel, but we try to give subjective, weird perspectives on the everyday implications of technology. So I think this is why we actually decided to co-host this panel with Transmediale. So without further ado, let me just say a quick word about you guys and then hand it over to whom everybody's probably waiting for. We're going to start with Kate Crawford, who will give a 15-minute presentation like everybody else, and I will be watching the time, obviously, as we decided. She's a researcher at Microsoft Research, a visiting professor at MIT Center of Civic Media, and she has done interview-based studies from big cities to small towns on the social implications of network technology, of data, and yes, she has sparked a few nice debates and gave us all some good insights on in the academic world, but also, I guess, in the broader digital public with things like 6 Myths of Big Data, which I really enjoyed. Then after that, she's going to hand over to Mark Coté, who's a lecturer at King's College in digital cultures and society, and a leading analyst of big social data, researching that not only through following his PhD on post-operationalist Foucault and shortcutting this research with terms borrowed and developed from Mauricio Lazzarato, like effective labor 2.0, which I think you're going to explain in just a minute what actually that is and what the use of this term would be. But also putting on some hackathons, I think, and actually doing big studies on how people can profit and use data and what it means to actually deal with those things. And lastly, it's going to be Paolo Cirio, who's going to be speaking about mainly his project loopholeforall.com, I believe. And Paolo is an artist who's won several international awards dealing conceptually with phenomena of data and network technology. Some other projects you guys might know would be the Google Street Ghost project, which has been featured prominently in the media, as has been his Loophole for All project. We all particularly enjoyed the coverage of the Cayman State Television, which I think you're going to show as well, a snippet of. Yes, so he's of course not making anything up, it's all real and true. So yeah, I'm quite excited. Yes. I think I wanted to give it a bit more legitimacy by that, so you don't have to, yeah. And afterwards, after your three presentations, there's going to be some responding words from Jussi, and I guess we'll see how it goes, but we'll be quite happy to have a long time for questions from the crowd and for a longer Q&A session. So without further ado, Kate, let me hand it over to you.
So good afternoon, guten Abend. It is a pleasure to be here. I'd like to say a particular thank you to Jussi for inviting me to Transmediale. But today what I want to talk about is data as a kind of bright light and the kind of underlying logics of data as a constant illumination. So Jacques Derrida once referred to metaphors of light as forming the basis of all philosophy. He, in fact, referred to the entire history of philosophy as a photology. And of course, Marshall McLuhan is also very well known as having this interest in light as being the most pervasive medium. He saw light as a type of pure information. But what happens when this pure light of information is designed to perpetually brighten our cities and eliminate all shadows? This is the question that I want to pose to you today. But first, I'm going to take you here. This is Andorra. It's a tiny state nestled in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. Andorra had a difficult time recovering from the European financial crisis in 2010 and is currently developing a fairly radical plan, which is to gather and sell all the data of its citizens. They're currently developing a platform to sell data from internet and energy providers, city sensors, bus and taxi companies, including purchasing habits as well. Critically, Andorra is also going to sell anonymized individual data, and that includes telephony metadata. According to the project's own site, this vision is going to go beyond your typical smart city as it seeks to create a real-world living lab. Now, this may sound fairly extreme, but in actual fact, these types of real-world labs are being established in major cities around the world, from New York to London to Barcelona to Amsterdam and Songdo. This enthusiasm for big data urban planning often results in cities that look curiously the same, regardless of the culture in which they're located. I want to share with you a couple of images from the kinds of advertising and marketing that we see around smart cities. This one, for example, comes from a major conference in Barcelona, and they often feature these glowing skylines and then zoom in to attractive urbanites doing appealing things like riding their bikes, as you can see this one from Sydney, where we see floating numbers as they flirt with each other, telling us things like how many cups of coffee they had that day or how many vegetables they grew that year. But behind it all, there is a back end which always features a dashboard, I would suggest this is our era's prevailing design metaphor for the central controller where all data goes, to be viewed by somebody, a government, a business. It all depends on who is selling the platform. But we know it's somebody other than the attractive bike-riding urbanites. They leave the data trail, and somebody else gathers, visualizes, and analyzes it. What we're witnessing here is the wholesale selling of an ideological program of data-centered city management, although it's really not clear what vision of ethics or democracy comes along with this. This computational turn is occurring simultaneously in the public and the private sectors, and of course, most notably in this increasingly blurry space where the two are working in partnership. I want to give you another example. This one is from North America, thanks to an investigative piece that came out just a couple of weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal. We learned a bit more about a company called Turnstile, which is establishing hundreds of sensors throughout the city of Toronto. Now, what's interesting about this process is that these sensors are gathering Wi-Fi signals, which are being emitted by your phone as you walk down the street, as your phone is seeking out open Wi-Fi networks. Can I just check who here in the room currently has Wi-Fi enabled on their phone? Can you put your hand up if you do? Okay, so pretty much most of the room. Well, that means all of you who just put your hands up would currently be gathered by these particular sensors, and they would be tracking you as you go from a session at Transmediale to a cafe, to a restaurant, and to home. These locations are then preserved and attached to the unique identification number of your phone. This data is all being gathered essentially without your knowledge and without your active participation. It's then anonymized into large documents, which are then sold back to local businesses who want to use this data to try and target deals to you more specifically. The example that the Wall Street Journal used was a local Asian restaurant that bought this data and discovered that many of its customers also liked going to the local gym. So what they did with that information is that they printed up workout tank tops with their logo attached. So all of that infrastructure, all of that consentless tracking because you went there and you had noodles once. Or to put it another way, my life is tracked 24/7 by big data marketers and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. But of course, mass data gathering is being justified in far more rational context rather than just better marketing. Things like improving traffic, fixing potholes, contributing to public health by tracking disease, and of course, developing predictive policing, which is designed to prevent crime before it happens. But in reality, I'd suggest this is an enormous social experiment, and we really don't have a clear sense of the outcomes yet. But it does provide a set of complex questions that I want to share with you today. What is the ethical framework that's being imagined alongside with these big data cities? What does it mean to be tracked everywhere we go as easily as we are tracked online when we have this profound slippage between the digital and the physical? How can people choose to opt out of these kinds of systems? Well, this is a pretty hard question to answer when this neoliberal drive towards the technocratic city is happening out of sight of many of the people who will be worst affected. That is, those who are not white or wealthy or well-connected. Fundamentally, this big data vision of cities is being undergirded by the belief that with more data comes more control. As Adam Greenfield has written, smart cities are founded in a discomfort with unpredictability, a positive terror of the unforeseen and the emergent. In short, a palpable nervousness about the urban itself. In other words, the big data vision of the city is actually driven by a fear of the city, and which is ultimately a fear of risk. That after 9/11 and the financial crisis, there's a desire to minimize all that is unknown and unpredictable, while at the same time maximizing business opportunity. But this might have quite unpleasant consequences for those of us who live in these places. And if you want to see the future of surveillance, as Virginia Eubanks has suggested, just ask poor communities. Poor and working class Americans, she notes, already live in the surveillance future. The revelations that are so scandalous to the middle class, data profiling, PRISM, tapped cell phones, are old news to millions of low-income Americans, immigrants, and communities of colour. These are the groups who are always exposed to extra scrutiny, from the fingerprinting of day labourers that has been occurring in Los Angeles to the individual purchase tracking of those who are on welfare. Into these pre-existing surveillance economies come these new techniques of big data-driven predictive policing, where data models are being used to shine an investigative light on problem areas of a city. However, focusing police activity on particular computer-generated heat maps can reinforce the same groups as pre-criminals, and I would suggest can institutionalize differential policing as a kind of standard practice. So this is why I want to move beyond always framing these issues in terms of privacy. Privacy is too small a lens when it's understood in this individualistic sense as an individual right and also a responsibility to somehow protect yourself from these systems. The scale of the problem far exceeds an individual. It is systemic. These are ultimately issues of ethics, agency, and often civil rights. In many of these large-scale experiments, citizens are in a state of forced participation, which begs the question of whether these kinds of experiments would ever pass an ethics review. I mean, in these contexts, human data is just being taken without consent. People don't get direct compensation, they don't get to determine how long the data is held, and in many cases, they're not even aware the data is being gathered. And this lack of awareness matters because, as the artist who produced Shadows of the Drone, James Bridle, puts it, those who cannot perceive the network cannot act effectively within it and are powerless to change it. So the epistemological basis here is as clear as it is suspect. If knowledge and power are always defined as having more data, and if more data somehow always means more safety and efficiency, where do you stop? Where do you draw the line? This becomes a regime of endless measurement, a collect-it-all, industrial-grade neo-positivism driven by a desire to unearth all hidden places and thoughts, illuminating all of the darkened corners. De Soto once described his image of what a horrific city would look like, and he imagined a desert in which the terrifying no longer would take the form of shadows, but would become this implacable light that would produce an urban text without obscurities, created by a technocratic power everywhere. He has this fantastic phrase that I particularly love, where he describes cities brutally lit by an alien reason, which kind of makes me think of a Google Earth for like human subjectivities, and ultimately immobilizes society into this completely transparent text. Of course, one of the responses that I hear a lot to research into big data cities is that technology could actually solve these problems. We just need better Wi-Fi blocking apps, more crypto, geolocation blockers, switching our phones into airline mode, or just stop using them altogether. As Evgeny Morozov wrote recently, we need to engage in information boycotts. But this kind of media refusal, as Portwood Stacer describes it, is, I'd suggest, a solution for elites. And this is where I think we can look at the labour politics of how many people's jobs actually require them to do things like carry a phone or use email, or in some cases, in the service industries, actually be friendly and sociable on Facebook. So that means that these large emergent data systems are not necessarily giving us ways out, certainly not for everybody and not all the time. Even if you could choose to never use a smartphone or email or Facebook, you're still being tracked and observed by these distributed sensors, and combined with predictive modeling, you will still exist as data. So one thing I'd like to ask everybody, what does resistance look like when terms like opt-in and opt-out have essentially lost their meaning, faced with this cocktail of technologies that become exponentially more powerful in combination? I think Bruce Schneier put it best when he said that we have to think about these things in concert. So it's street cameras, plus facial recognition, plus Facebook, plus tagged photos, plus drones. The whole is much more alarming than the sum of the surveilling parts. So Hannah Arendt, in her writings about the public realm, wrote about the danger to human existence from the elimination of the private. And here, what I think is so useful is that she moves beyond this individual conception of privacy to take us to something about a collective experience. And she uses a phrase strikingly similar to de Soto when she writes that there are a great many things which cannot withstand the implacable bright light of the constant presence of others on the public scene. So without a private space for identity formation and the shielding of intimate details from others, the public, as we know it, simply couldn't be constituted. And so I think we need to ask some critical questions about the kind of life that is going to be illuminated in big data cities as we walk down the street in New York or in Andorra or in Toronto. This data-driven city management is based on models that have built within them an idea of what it is to be normal. The unquestioned data biases inform the way that data is interpreted. As Jeff Bowker reminds us, though, raw data is both an oxymoron and a bad idea. And we need to critically examine these data models and the normative assumptions that lie beneath them. Otherwise, big data city labs are essentially for the powerful, where unpredictable behavior, that is, anything outside of the model, is always seen as a kind of threat. So as a final provocation, I want to offer you this. This is a desire line. It's a concept that emerged from urban planning and architecture to account for those kinds of unpredictable shortcuts that emerge in public space. Desire lines occur when people want to avoid the official way and choose something that might be faster or more direct or more pleasurable. And I see them as a kind of evidence of collective unplanning, of deploying a different sense of how a city should work, not as a lab or as a capturable data set, but as what Lukács called the anarchy of the everyday. I think desire lines can show us some of these fundamental tensions: communities versus institutions, participation versus entrapment, improvisation versus rigidity. And I think this is in contrast to the kind of technocratic emphasis on control and predictability. And while I'm not so optimistic as to suggest that somehow desire lines represent a means of escape from the big data city, I do think it suggests a different ethical model of the urban, one that leaves room for making things up as we go, for changing our minds, and for being invisible when we want to be. So what kind of ethical frameworks can we, and I mean the people at these kinds of conferences, people who are makers and builders and architects and thinkers, what models can we design for big data cities that will allow for desire lines? What will that even look like? Or to put it another way, are we going to get to choose who is tracking us, or will we be forever followed by the most empowered and the most privileged? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers. Thank you to Jussi. Thanks to everybody for coming out. And thank you, Kate. It's great resonance between what you just presented and what I'm about to present. And I should note that we didn't consult with each other at all. So I think that that indicates that there's a kind of a sharpening focus on the term big data, which sort of, started off in a marketer's dream, but now I think has become something that really is useful for us thinking about our contemporary condition. So today I'm going to ask one simple question. In the afterglow, how does the digital human become something other than an object of surveillance and exchange? I'm going to pursue this question via big data, both in terms of some ongoing research projects that I'm doing at King's College London, and also in relation to some concepts that I think are useful for helping us to think past the trash. I can't guarantee that it will take us to the treasure, but I think to perhaps more progressive uses. So let me start by stating the obvious. Big data is indeed Big Brother. Most of you will be familiar with this week's latest revelations. Here's my 5-year-old son. He's playing Angry Birds Star Wars, as he would remind me. Now, something that's somewhat lovely, I think, becomes unsettling when we think about the NSA and the GCHQ scooping data from leaky apps, and we start to think about how all of our mobile devices are indeed vectors of information, how we think even apps are generating demographic information, our age, gender, location, and sometimes more our income, our ethnicity, our sexual orientation, and so on. Some of this data we generate when we sign up and fill in user fields and click yes on those annoying but important T&C agreements. Some of it is generated by our devices, machine to machine. Until recently, a lot of people, I think, consider that metadata as being relatively trivial. I think that we can see it as an increasingly critical element in the ongoing process of our becoming the digital human. So yes, big data is Big Brother, but as importantly, big data is also capital. Just with the example of Angry Birds, we can see it's not just the app itself. It's the third parties, the app-affiliated ad platforms. It's the highly complex feedback loop of rich information sharing among the app, among data brokers, among data management platforms. Yes, such entities exist and they're highly profitable. Advertisers and so on. So this is the trash, I would say, of big data. The problem is many of our mediated cultural practices occur in these circuits of consumption, wherein the data rubbish collectors of capital, they take it away, they mix it up with endless bins of other data trash, and then they bring them back and dump them one after the other, all of this aggregated data trash on top of us. And they do all of this to make us better, that is, more profitable consumers. But I don't want to focus on that primarily today, because big data, big social data, that is also us. For the rest of my time, I want to talk about big social data, whereby I mean the metadata, the symbolic content that we generate in our everyday lives. So this is excluding the vast sensor networks and big science projects, etc. This is the digital stuff of our mediated cultural and communicative practices. When I say big social data, I don't mean it in terms of the digital traces that represent the real you. I'm not positing big social data in the service of a discursive subject. Rather, I'm talking about the very stuff that comprises the digital human. So let me quickly flag a few key practical and ontological implications. So practically, in terms of what one might do, if we think about big social data beyond signifying structures, this then mutes the siren call that big data will bring ever greater verisimilitude via more finely granulated data points. Right? So that all we need is more social scientific deployment for greater evidence-based verity. This is a kind of Enlightenment revival that drives much in capital and among many academics, but it's not really my interest, because I'm positing that big social data is indeed constitutive of the digital human. This is the mediated materiality of our contemporary condition. It's not just the ubiquitous connectivity, but it's the increasingly ubiquitous generation of discrete data traces, so that for me it becomes nonsensical to speak of the real of our existence as being separate from our digital exteriorization. And further, we have precious little control over the flow and the aggregation of the big social data that otherwise constitutes us. Here I think the French philosopher Gilbert Simondon offers some helpful concepts so that we can better understand the deeply constitutive relation between the human and technology, addressing what he calls the ignorance of the technical object, taking us beyond facile humanism. So we can start by thinking of big social data as a technical object. Simondon takes a strongly anti-constructivist position here, quote, as if technical objects do not contain human reality, something like a human, non-human environment, a media environment or ecology, things that Jussi and others here have written a lot about. For Simondon, it's a milieu. It's one that's calibrated by the technical object. And more importantly, it begins with a pre-individual state, a disparate collective state from which we emerge. So like the big social data, which separates and links non-individuated beings. So in short, I'm suggesting to think of big social data not just as that which you generate, but an environment that in turn creates this pre-individual milieu from which we are constantly becoming. I'll come back to that, but briefly I just want to turn to metadata. I think all of the recent revelations that we've had have given us reason to rethink metadata, right, beyond it being that mere machine-to-machine communication. If we consider the increasingly sophisticated algorithmic practices of capital in the security state, we see that it provides a rather nuanced insight into cultural practices of the digital human. So we're facing a technological problematic with a profound human component because machine data increasingly is us. It's becoming a core mode of exteriorization. As Mark Hansen notes, such metadata acts currently primarily in a predeterminative manner. So it sets up these undesirable points of non-human or material agency. And because this data is also motile, that means it moves beyond our control, largely in the hands of capital in the state, but we remain profoundly tethered to it. Right? So in a sense, you could say that we are suffering from a very profound democratic deficit when it comes to data. So here I just want to briefly speak to a research project that we're just undertaking right now in London. We're partnering with a group of teen coders. We're giving them smartphones. We're talking to them about their mediated cultural practices or attitudes toward information sharing and privacy. And then we're going to hold a hackathon so that as a counterpoint to the NSA and the GCHQ's scooping, they can hack their phones and access the metadata and the symbolic content that they are generating. Right? In short, we're looking to work with them to develop tools and applications for the capture, the storage, and the consideration of the very big social data that we generate, that follows us all the time, but that we don't have direct access to. We want to think about what an ethical framework for data sharing would look like to make it available for widespread community use. So in a sense, we're looking to create a big social data commons, or at least a proof of concept of that, as a community resource and as a means to explore new passages from potential to actualization, because I think that the social data that we generate is central in that process. So briefly, I want to talk about anonymity, because I think we can ask, what is anonymity for the digital human? And if we just think about the two contexts that I've covered so far, there's one where your data is scooped surreptitiously by the security state. There's another where capital captures, mines, and aggregates your data. And even if we just bracket aside the security state for a moment, for the latter, let's assume that anonymization practices are followed. Well, what does that really mean when it gets processed in a manner that invariably pings back to you anyway? As such, is privacy really an existing condition of the digital human? Because it rather locks us into these profiles in these circuits of consumption or as some kind of security threat. So, and furthermore, what would a political strategy that foregrounded privacy mean anyway? Would it be a militant movement of becoming of data rights holders? So there's a basic problem, and that's that we don't really meaningfully own the very big social data that we generate. From the moment that we tap send, it flows through a highly proprietary environment where it remains largely inaccessible to us. And then it returns back to us in the banality of a targeted ad or a push notification, or more seriously, in a security flag, the whole while it's constantly recalibrating our conditions of possibility. So look, anonymity and privacy are indeed very important and desirable, but what if the desire instead is toward an open sharing of information? That's an impulse that we're following up in a research project that we're going to pursue with the Open Data Institute in London, to think about the flip side of privacy, to think about an open data culture. Right? We intend to think about what would an ethical and iterable environment of information sharing look like beyond blunt instruments of anonymization technologies, to think about reinscribing a degree of autonomy over information sharing, so that we can begin to think about what data we will share with whom under what circumstances, and in turn deepening an association with the milieu within which our big social data is generated. And then we can start to think about different kinds of potential social surpluses that might be created. I think Simondon captures something important here when he speaks of the potential that's invented by new relations. So if we're thinking about open data, just really quickly, the idea of open data is just data that's available for anybody to use for any purpose free of cost. It would be in standard and structured formats, be interoperable, could be linked, could be easily processed. This is in stark contrast to the proprietary environments through which big social data currently flows. And for me, it's a practical approach to think about a new political imaginary, one that's where we can think in terms of invention, right? The linking of different sets of potential. Masumi talks about it when he talks about clinching disparate elements into new levels of functioning beyond something, somewhat desirable like using your phone and knowing where you're going, or being further integrated into just deeper into a circuit of production. And I think that this can help us to move beyond the contemporary condition of the digital human, right? Where via big social data, we are objects of exchange. Right, entailing all those elements of labor, of debt, and of singular pursuit of value. So, okay, I want to make just a few concluding remarks because time is short. So I'm suggesting that big social data is a technical object that calibrates our contemporary condition as the digital human. I've suggested that Simondon is helpful because he provides a conceptual paradigm that, for me, is most opposite to this historical moment of big social data. In part, this is because he doesn't begin with the individual. So it's not about an ontology of being. Instead, he posits this pre-individual state that is brimming with potential energy, right? So there's this ontogenesis of this becoming. Right? He calls this initial supersaturation of being, right? That's characterized by an excess of potential energy that's metastable. So think of a snow-laden slope, right, just before the avalanche. The realm, and this is the realm from which individuation transpired. This is the state of big social data, and this is exactly why capital and the security state love it so much, because it offers them unprecedented opportunities to predetermine passages from potential to actualization. And this is why, for me, big social data is not just a technical object, but it's a political tool and indeed a weapon. Because while we exist on the side of individuation, our ubiquitous exteriorization of big social data offers unique access to that pre-individual state, right? Because if we think about it, what happens to it momentarily, it's in a liminal space when it's created, and then it becomes, as it were, in the manners in which it gets linked with the totality of other data around it, right? So there are myriad possibilities in the digital afterglow. I see the supersaturated state of big social data as being ripe for creative political intervention. Collectively, we generate this excess. Collectively, what kind of potential can we create with new relations? Thank you.
Hello. So hi to everyone. Thanks for having invited me here. There is little time and big data, so I will try to be really quick with an overview on my work about big data. So I am a media artist, and some projects are actually pretty much about big data, and I will focus on them. So my art is, I can say that it's about reconfiguring information asymmetries of power of structures. And it's pretty much about recontextualization of big personal data, financial data, but in general sensible data. That's what I am focused on. And so it's big data for big engagement in terms of people engaged in this data and how I want to reach a big audience. That means big data. But in this engagement, I often have also a type of casualty, kind of collateral damage from my artworks, because in big data there is also someone that eventually don't want to be involved in my work. And so it happens that after publishing the project, I usually have corporate, media, personal, legal reaction. There's also something common in my project, as you will see. And some question that I am interested on through my work is the ownership of data, so open versus private. And it was interesting to see open data when it comes down to privacy. And so the other point is privacy versus transparency, and that is a really big, important thing when you're working with open data. And then I try to have having effective social change through artistic use of data. So I would start from this project that is actually 2007, probably before then big data was a thing. So it's called People Quote People. This is like the offline installation, and basically there are quotes about plagiarism, but actually there are misquotations, so the author is not the real one of the quote. And that come here in this website called People Quote People, that is about 3,000 quotes by important and famous people that every time that you load this page are remixed. So you never know who is the real author of these quotes. And over the probably 7 years that this project this website is online, I probably spread quite a bit of misquotation. And here is about the overproduction, creative production that we have with internet. After all, also artworks become big data at this point when there are so many artists and so many creative minds out there. So this is just like a really old project. Let's go to see different strategies that I have in using big data. And so I focus on particular characteristics. So it can be about the form, the quality, the quantity, the sensitivity, and the value of data. And I try to unveil new meanings out of this data, because data by itself doesn't have any meaning. And how do I do that? By recontextualizing data. So I am not really interested in mapping or info design or this type of visualization of data, but it's more interesting for me to recontextualize the data in another environment to figure out, to give it a new meaning and unveiling new meaning. And so sometimes it's about even materialization of this data, and then it's performed, subverted, and so on. And that will be clear by presenting the next project. That is Face to Facebook, that was actually presented here in Transmediale in 2011 with Alessandro Ludovico, that I think is in the room too. So this was probably the first project with real big data, and it was about harvesting 1 million profile of Facebook all over the world. So it was basically just a script starting from one random person on Facebook and scraping, collecting the name, surname, and the public profile, and from that, looking for random 8 friends and doing the same in a recursive way, so potentially harvesting all the data of Facebook. And then has been filtered all this database of 1 million people, sorry, let's go online, has been filtered with the facial recognition software to figure out which facial expression they had, and then all this data has been published on this dating website without the authorization of these people, of course, and ended up to be a database of 250,000 people, so the 25% of the big data that I had, basically giving rid of all the noise. And so here, the functionality were pretty interesting, so you could find for a potential partner from your country with a specific likes about a movie and so on, and especially with a type of temperament, climber, funny, mild, and so on. So this generated quite a lot of reaction, as I say, the personal reaction, people that overreact because they didn't want to be on this dating website. After a week, we received the first cease and desist letter from Facebook. And so we had to shut down this website just after a week, but we documented all the reaction. Facebook asked to give back them all this data that we didn't do. So this is actually the dating website that I still have on a private server that is not public, but we still have all this data for ads. So I am moving on with a similar approach with another project that is persecuting ads. So also in this case was about focusing on the quantity of the data. And so it's again a database of 1 million Americans sorted by political affiliation. So I was basically harvesting every single person that was tweeting about the US election, like just mentioning Obama with an hashtag, but not just that person, but 100 friends of that person that tweeted. So I also analyzed the social connection that that person had. And then through, it was actually quite hard, but through other data that I had, I tried to sort them and give them a kind of a rate. So this, for example, in the homepage, there are extremist activists because they're really left-wing or right-wing, but you can go down till like 10% right-wing and so on. So this is real people, and so you can click on a profile of this person, like this is like the page, there is really big data, so I don't know how many people and who is these people. But this, for example, is a guy that is right-wing, and in some case I can also track where he lives. Now it's just say Texas, but sometimes they leave the exact position, geolocation. And then you can actually persecute this guy and tweet to him and send him a threat, say, hey, fucking fascist, go to hell. And this is basically a project trying to engage people in an info-civil war in a way, and so basically pushing what is happening every day on Twitter. Okay, moving on. Another project that is about big data somehow is on Google Street View. So Google Street View, it is big data because Google collects pictures of every single corner of thousands of cities around the world. And with that, they also collect all the type of data like open Wi-Fi and so on, and try to profile houses and public space and so on. So in this case, though, with this project, it didn't focus on the quantity of that data, but on the form of the data. So I tried to visualize it, materialize it, and bring it back from the point where it was extracted. So really briefly, basically look for random people on Google Street View, and when I find some interesting picture of someone, I take a screenshot of that, and then I print that picture, real size, human size, somehow with an estimation. And then since it's a print paper, I go back to the exact spot where that picture has been captured by Google, and I paste it at the exact location. So on this side, you have the picture on Google Street View, the screenshot. In this side, you have my poster, basically. So in this case, again, the big data is materialized in a different way. But what is interesting that also come out with the name, the ghost, they are ghosts from the past. Most of these pictures are pretty old, like in Berlin, they're all from the 2007. And so these are people coming back from the past that appear back from our world. And we eventually will be all ghosts because all our data on Facebook and Twitter in 200 years will be traded in different way. And we, of course, we won't have control over that. So this is just a way to bring up bigger discourse. And then also what happens when you bring back data that is virtualized to the physical world, and so other critical point emerge. And then about who is the owner of this picture? Is that person, is Google, who is allowed to use this type of material in artistic context? As an artist, can I use this material? And so I also keep the watermark on this picture, so it comes with the copyright and so on. An interesting point that this person, for example, is a casualty of this info war, again, between a crazy artist like me, Google, the legislator that should regulate these things, and also the algorithms that try to blur these pictures. So that is really an info war where also an artist like me can play. And unfortunately, this guy has been captured in this war. Moving on. These three projects were about privacy, and there is no time to go through, but I also developed a little theory about this way to engage random crowd in my work without their authorization and permission, and that's something that is completely new. It's actually an opportunity for an artist somehow, having like millions of people all of a sudden involved in my artwork and having this engagement, people that write me and react in a good and a bad way. And it's also interesting how these reactions are pretty similar in all these cases. So I won't go through all these texts, and I move on into this project. That's another approach to big data, and it's actually about open data and transparency, and it's much more recent, and is Loophole for all. So going online. So Loop for All is about offshore finance and Cayman Islands companies. So in this case, I went to the website of the Cayman Island Registry. That's basically a governmental website. And you can ask permission to see the list of their company, all the company incorporated there. So I asked permission, although it came with legal disclaimer to not use that data, and I created a script that was looking for every possible company registered in the Cayman Islands. So I managed to basically steal all that database that ended up to be over 200,000 companies in the Cayman Islands, every single company registered on the Cayman Islands. And so was the really poor information that they had, because it was just about the name of the company and their tax number related to that company. So I was keep investigating about this issue for months, if not year, till I ended up to finding about this document that is certificate of incorporation on the Security Exchange Commission website, the U.S. Security Commission. Oh, there is Wi-Fi. And so I started to issue this counterfeited certificate of incorporation with actually my name. And so what happened, that this document, this certificate incorporation that is loading, is basically the ID, is the passport of these companies. The reason why these companies are in the Cayman Island is because of secrecy, anonymity in a way. So Cayman Island government sold that anonymity. So you don't know who is the real owner of those companies, but because you don't know who is the real owner, everyone can pretend to be that owner. So basically this website promote to steal the identities of this real company based in the Cayman Island and using that identity to avoid taxes onshore, like in Germany. So you could buy this certificate of incorporation issued through my name that I just pretend to be the registrar of company at the Cayman Island and sign with my real signature. So you could buy this document in a really cheap version, 99 cents, or even printed on other option. And through that, through this document, you could start to invoice with that company. So these generated a few reactions. I was surprised. I didn't know about that document. You know, it could be important or not. Back at the time, I wasn't sure it was important, but it was. And this generated the reaction of the Cayman Island press. So it was on TV, in the national TV at the Cayman Island, on a couple of newspapers. But this is even more interesting because it's from Bermuda. So this is a newspaper from Bermuda that say, oh no, this artist is gonna come here and target Bermuda too with the same type of document. And this is like actually a national newspaper in the Bermuda, and so I basically found out that was a vulnerability even beyond the Cayman Island. And so this is, for example, a few comments that have been written on a Cayman Island article. And so it's interesting because they generated a debate inside the Cayman Island, when it's actually an issue always debated outside the Cayman Island. So someone say, why doesn't the government of Cayman Island sue this guy? And the one else say, a comedian might say that the real ones are also fake. That is true. And so, and then I started to receive a legal threat via email that to me sounded really common with other projects that I had. And so this, for example, is a company, a real company at Cayman Island, just say, I don't want to be on this website. These companies are really low-key companies, so they are honest business in the Cayman Island. And again, this is a casualty in big data in a way. I didn't want to target them, but it happened. And so they just say, don't want to be here, and that happened for a few companies that they just say, please remove my name from there. And it's interesting because these people that dare to write me because they don't have any problem to unveil their real name, the problem is who doesn't write me because they don't want to unveil their real name, and that is much trickier. And so it gets more heavy. And so, for example, this is a accounting firm that say you are doing something really illegal and you're affecting my business, of course, because they are selling companies there. There is no time to go through. And this gets more aggressive. You get this off today. I am going to the cops and so on. Literally, here this guy is saying, I am going to the next police station here at the Cayman Island, and I will track you down. And this guy was really aggressive. But he also said this company is completely legal, legit, you know, it's certified, and so on. This was still a really kind of low-profile company. And at this point, I removed that company, and this guy say, okay, I agree, probably also on your social point, political point, that is quite interesting, that these people actually, after all, they say, you have done a great stuff, by the way. But be worried, because there are some criminal here that may use other type of way to look after you. And this is a letter that I received a week ago. It's a proper season. This is letter from a huge, unfortunately you cannot read the address, it's a huge law firm from China based in Hong Kong and in Beijing that say remove now these 4 companies from that website. And this is a really big company managing wealth for the elite of Chinese. And they received these later the same day that the media started to unveil all this scandal of Chinese elite having offshore account in the British Virgin Islands. So probably these are connected to that scandal, but I don't know, and I just unfortunately had to remove this name from that website. And this, by the way, is the PayPal that also reacted and froze all the money that I made because I actually was selling these identities. And they banned me from PayPal. And the interesting thing that is PayPal is based in Luxembourg and is avoiding taxes for billions too. I think that is all, probably.
Thank you, Paolo. So I think the way we're going to go now, as I see it, you might want to respond, and then we'll take questions from the audience to anyone.
Yeah, and I actually think we can go quite quickly to questions because we got a big room full of people, and I'm sure you're eager to ask questions, and in a way also kind of responding so quickly after just, the whole talks unfolded is always difficult. But really a big thanks to all three speakers. I think they kind of exactly articulated the ways in which we can use and abuse big data in various kind of very theoretical ways, but also pedagogical ways as well as artistic ways. I think a lot of the questions, a lot of the papers in a way back the kind of they articulate the fact that obviously big data is something that articulates societies on a global scale level from the pole of entertainment to the pole of security and militarization of everyday life. What was interesting, of course, is the fact that, and a kind of tiny reminder that might be obvious again, but we need to be making sure that it gets mentioned always, is the fact that big data, again, makes itself visible, is constantly visible through various very material urban spheres, hardware, as well as with concrete effects, whether it's a threat from some guy in Germany or so forth. So there's kind of materiality, a long trajectory of materiality having to do with big data as well. Again, to kind of refer back to Mackenzie Walker and his idea about third nature, Mackenzie Walker's idea of third nature in a way picks up on the idea that, obviously we got the first nature idea, but also then the Marxist tradition which was articulate the idea of second nature as appropriation, exploitation of natural resources, but also labor, and then third nature as this informational vector which builds on these other two, but also it kind of re-articulates our relation to the exactly already existing earlier natures, whether it's the natural resources or whether it's the urban sphere as well, like in some of Paolo's projects like Street Ghosts or in the kind of what you two also kind of brought forward. So there's a kind of a whole, if we want to kind of refer back to some, philosophical concepts in terms of how Felix Guattari talks about the ethico-aesthetic. All of this, all of the papers are in a way articulating an ethico-aesthetic stance towards it. And the aesthetics in the sense that we already heard yesterday's in panel, starting from Trevor Paglen's work, what is the role of an aesthetic observation as a production of knowledge about the relations that are otherwise easily invisible, but completely real? The visibility, but complete, reality of these relations that need to be articulated. But where does the articulation that might be of aesthetic sort go? And, Paolo is trying to do something that is actually, I like the phrase what you said, where this kind of artistic practice is about reprogramming social forms and so forth, which is already a kind of a step forward in terms of kind of real effects that might have some political consequences. Another question is where Kate started as well, is that, the ethical context that we need to be constantly asking, but where do we go with that, where increasingly any kind of democratic accountability of these actions, well, it's non-existent. So what are the kind of forums in which we are able to do anything with our thoughts about big data? So I'm just as a kind of basically, I'm just, saying what they already said, and as a kind of warm-up to your, I'm sure, very good questions and commentary. So please, the floor is open. And we got mics.
And there is a microphone that, yeah.
Hello, it's Andreas. Thanks for really engaging talks, very enlightening in different ways. I'd like to ask Mark Coté to say a little bit more about this notion of the digital human, which was a little bit surprising for me, but maybe then not so much, and I'd just like you to speak about it more, what you mean by that, and how the digital human is different from other forms of humans.
Well, what I'm primarily trying to draw upon there is to think about the ways in which the human has always been constituted via or with technology, that there's never been a natural state of the human outside of that constitutive relationship. If we even think back far to sort of speciation, before we were human, we had a deeply recursive relationship with with lithic industry, with stone tools. And there's a sense that there's a persistent sense of this separation, this a radical split where we can speak discretely of the natural human, and then the different kinds of technology that act as prosthetically with the human. But indeed, we've always had that constitutive relationship, and what I think is interesting about the digital, so one of the ways to think about that as well is how the human exteriorizes thought and indeed memory and life itself, and how we're now, and that's always happened in a sort of a fundamental, or you could say transductive relationship with technology, and how now it's this effortless, just existence itself produces these digital traces for most of us. It's not something that we set out to do, many times we do, but there is a sort of unprecedented situation whereby we can't live without, or most of us do not live without generating these vast amounts of data. One of those basic things that we want to do with the Team Coder is simply to develop an app or a tool that will allow us to say, here's 24 hours in your life. This is the sum total of data that you've generated today, and to visualize that, and to think about that, and to think about how, to the degree to which the metadata correlates with the content that you otherwise actively generate, just to start to think about that other realm. But I guess the other thing that I wanted to emphasize is that that is not something that represents us or is separate from us, but as we move through our mediated environment, that profoundly is enabling and constraining what we can do. So I guess I was trying to draw on a general condition of the human, which is that constitutive relationship with technology, and just to think about it in terms of our contemporary condition.
Hi. Actually, I do want to address Mark and Kate similarly with that question. Now, first of all, thank you very much for these talks. I mean, that was a bit like a party, I think, on big data. I'm very skeptical about this big data thing, and I think some of you guys have said that it is a term that we are still using, which is there, but nobody really knows where it goes. Now, I would like to address this issue of capital on one hand, and on the other hand, what Kate mentioned about the desire lines and designing systems where we allow for those desire lines. Now, Mark was saying big data is big brother and also big capital. Now, the other side of the medal, in a way, is that open big data is also a territory where we can gain knowledge and define and design tools for a further level of social interaction or agency, and also creating new ways of living. So in that sense, is there a sort of dichotomy or something like this between the political abuse of data and the use of data, but also what we use as open data and open source software and programs, especially when it comes to scripting and coding and these things. There's a lot of open source software. But then again, the data we get has been filtered beforehand. So, I mean, this is really the crux of the whole thing. There might be a lot of data, but how do we decide, first of all, which data can we get, which data can we use positively? I mean, on the short run, we don't know what happens, but it has been recontextualized beforehand and not after. So I think there's a big problem, which is it's a theoretical problem, it's an ethical problem, but it's also a practical problem. And honestly, I think we're not like the digital human anymore. I think we are more like a post digital paraspace human, in a way? I mean, para in the sense of a second cyber.
I'm not quite sure how to respond to that, because I'm not quite sure what you mean about how the data has been processed before we would access it. One of the things, I should stress that we're in still a relatively early stage of our research project, and in fact, we're just beginning to meet with the teen coders, and so we don't have anything developed. Ideally, for us, this is a question of precisely addressing what is a profound asymmetry, which is that the majority of us have no meaningful access outside of the different applications and tools that we're using. We don't have access to this very data that has capital and the security state so excited, and that is altering the way in which we interact with one another, and where we are being directed in highly functional circumstances. So precisely, I think, in that way, perhaps that you mean about the way that it's been processed in a way. One of the things, as I said, that we'd like to do is simply to capture the kind of the data as it leaves any application or any aspect, anything that you're generating on your phone, just for pedagogical purposes, just to sit down and say, what is this? How does it relate to me? What is, I often imagine it would be so amazing if you could put the equivalent of an RFID tag onto a bit of data that you generate and then follow its life and see all the places it goes and who it gets, kind of like the packages, the keyboards that Jacob Appelbaum was talking about last night. But in terms of, where does that exactly go? We don't even know. So for me, this is a project that is fundamentally about trying to empower all of us. I hope I didn't sound too utopian, as if I imagined that in a few projects suddenly we're going to be just empowered data citizens and it's all going to be wonderful. And it's rather that we need, this is a very long-term process, and maybe one of the main things that we're going to discover is people actually don't want to share most of their data. And that's completely plausible. But we're not even in a situation right now where the majority of us can address that and even start to think about it. So it's kind of steps to get to think about what it is that we produce and what we might want to do with it. Because no matter what is happening right now is that we are generating this data in our individuated states, but then once it gets generated and then takes that form, it becomes something else. It becomes a kind of commons or that new sort of pre-individuated state, and then it's almost always capital or the security state that is predetermining or impacting upon the manner in which those connections are made. And then those are the lives that we all lead. And I just think that we should collectively be taking a more active role in that space. And that because of this digital state, we can do that in a way that we couldn't before.
I think it's a really interesting question. I'd have to foreground this by saying I might be a little less optimistic than Mark about exactly how much agency we have to intervene with our own data. But the way I'd like to answer your question is by looking at this sort of historical frame, because I think you're right. There's actually a really interesting ideological clash that's happening pretty much right about now. We've had almost 10 years of the shift towards the open data movement, and in particular in relation to opening government data. And this has been championed across the public and private sectors, that data should be free, people should be able to remix this data, use it in different ways. And in some ways that's actually been a very powerful, very useful stage. But we've now got to this new point where we can see that those very data streams, if combined in different ways and then brought together with things like telephony metadata, can actually give us profoundly intimate insights about small groups and even individuals. So I think there's actually a very interesting ideological clash that we're in at the moment, where people are like, first of all the data should be free, release the data, understand the data, to, well, actually, some of this data can produce really negative effects, particularly at a sort of a group discrimination level. So I think we're going to see a nuancing of the open data argument, and I actually think that's very necessary, and it's a very good moment for that to be happening. But in terms of these broader questions around how we start to reflect on our own data, there's an enormous shift also happening there in relation to health data. So you could think about the quantified self movement, people recording everything from what they eat to how they exercise to how they sleep. And again, this is championed as a form of empowerment, that, and this is particularly true, I'm thinking here in the US context, that even if you don't have full insurance, you could somehow use your data to heal yourself. And I think this is problematic for a couple of reasons. I think the first is that obviously the intermediaries who are gathering this data, be it Nike, be it Jawbone, be it somebody else, have very different reasons for why they're gathering that data. And in some cases, I think they don't even know. I think that the full usefulness of this data to reflect on whether somebody should pay a higher insurance premium is yet to be realized, but I think we have to ask these kinds of questions now. I think the other thing that's really concerning to me is when we see a kind of an arms race model, which is, well, they're collecting data about you, so you should start collecting data about yourself as well, and then you can analyze it. The reason why I'd throw a question into that mix is that I think it's fundamentally about a power imbalance. The people who are gathering data in the most powerful sectors of our society are much more able to use that and use that information in ways that will actually impact on people's lives, be it in terms of their access to medical care, their access to welfare, you name it. That's where I get most concerned. So I think when we construct these models of how we celebrate our own data, I think it's important to look at these broader data economies that they feed into, and then think about how, or if, firewalling that data is really possible, or whether we're trying to enter an arms race that we're always going to lose.
Well, I was already pretty terrified about what the situation looks like, but thank you for painting this picture even further for my brain to work with. And the question I might, well, a couple questions maybe if I can put them out there. One to Kate. What is it like to work with a civic media organization that is in MIT, which has done very much to set up this cybernetic regime? And maybe for all of you, if there's time, what sort of other civil disobedience ideas do you see coming on the horizon?
So yes, MIT has a very interesting history in terms of pushing a particular kind of cybernetic agenda. What I find really inspiring about the group of people who are at the Center for Civic Media, which is headed by Ethan Zuckerman, is that they're asking critical questions about what we might like a civic space to look like. And in some cases, they're using tools to critically examine the tools themselves. So almost this sort of recursive act of how we use tools to think about the generation of data. Some students are doing really inspiring projects looking at, I'm thinking here of Nate Matthias's work on gender, where he's looking at how newspapers around the world quote experts, and how the vast majority of those experts are male, and how that sets up particular kinds of spheres of knowledge and expertise that exclude women. I think these are really actually very profoundly political projects, but I'll also be honest that sometimes you can walk down the corridor and see other projects which can be terrifying, which can you say, well, what are the impacts of tracking students, for example, which is one of the things that MIT does. So I think in these sorts of these very edge-leading spaces, you get to both see these technologies, which informs my work, and the kinds of political critiques that I make. But I think it also creates some spaces where we could think about whether these tools can actually be used in ways that are positive. Or is it true that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house? I think that's an open question.
Well, I think there is an important question before everything else. That means what is the difference between transparency and privacy? So where are the borders between these two things? And I guess Also, we don't have actually a legal framework to deal with this big data, and that is the real problem, because or even like with older media, let's say TV or the publishing industry, we had some legal framework that was regulating advertising, for example, or independent news reporting. And we don't have these with data, so it's true that with the first question that was asking, how do we trust this open data that is generated from our city council? Yeah, maybe it's really open, it's perfect, but maybe they made that up, you know, so you don't know actually if there is some corruption in the city council, they may also like release open data, but you won't see it, so there's a problem. So we need some certification and some independent organization that check that data, for example. And then about privacy, of course, the problem is that you should be empowered to decide what to make public or not, or be tracked or not, and there is no legislation about that. But when it comes down to an individual that relate to the society, that must be completely transparent, like a company that hide everything in the Cayman Island to not having any type of social responsibility and accountability, and that is not right too. So I think that is the problem that need to be defined, when we need privacy and when you shouldn't have that privacy, because when an individual interacts with the society, actually that activity, in my opinion, should be transparent, for example. But if it's about your personal life, you should have the right to not publish that. And we culturally don't have these, definitions, and legally even less, I think.
I'm not sure what we'll see, but I think that, in the last while, we've seen how social media, for example, has become really fundamental to a whole host of social movements, and from the Arab Spring to Occupy and so on. And I wonder in what way big data, big social data, or if it will get taken up either as an object for political movement or civil disobedience, or to be utilized to kind of draw out different kinds of lines of affinity in terms of a movement going forward. And I have no idea what that'll look like, but I think that we will see something along those lines.
So I wonder if you're familiar with the artist Hassan Elahi. If you're not, he's an Indian American who was put on an FBI watch list, and his response to that was to upload his location via GPS and take pictures of where he was every hour. And despite this, he still believes he lives a very private life. And I think my generation has a very different kind of concept or understanding of privacy than previous generations. So I wonder if you can kind of convince me that. Not convince me. I wonder what you think of kind of the changes of privacy between generations, and how I think privacy is something completely different than kind of my parents' generation.
Yeah, this is a really big one, and it's kind of, for me, one of my bugbears, because of course one of the most common things I hear when I'm collaborating with data scientists or having these conversations about how data can be used is this idea that privacy is dead, and that actually young people don't care about privacy. This is trotted out as a kind of homily very frequently. To which I actually find Pew Internet research studies to be very, very useful to point to the fact that actually young people care more about privacy than people in the over 40 bracket, and they're doing more to think about how they protect their own data. So I think the idea that somehow young people are completely disinvested in this idea, I think, is problematic. But there's this meta level that's operating, which is that, is privacy a sufficient frame? And what I'm trying to argue today is that I don't think it is. I actually think it's too small. And if we try to talk about privacy as being the solution to these kinds of enormous systems that we've been talking about today, then we've already lost. And that actually it's much more important to start putting this in the context of ethics, of agency, of resistance, of how we actually think about collectively addressing these issues, because I think individually we simply don't have the power to resist these kinds of superstructures. So I think privacy is obviously still important, but I think particularly in the US discourse, it's been narrowed down to the individual level, and I think that whittling away has actually been really dangerous. So I think it's time to open up the lens a bit.
So I think there was a question over there. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I want to just cut to the chase, and let's assume that at some point in the near future, laws are passed, a regulatory agency is set up, and people have total control over their data footprint. You can opt in, you can opt out. It's up to you. What's the worst case scenario? What is going to happen to the world? Is it just a case where we're not going to be able to use social media? Is it a marketing issue? Or artists like Paolo are just not going to be able to make websites? What are the consequences of people totally opting out of the world of big data collection? I'd like to ask anybody who's got any ideas on that.
Paolo, question for you. What can we expect then?
Such of like bad future. No, I think it's just gonna be a positive thing in a way if this data is going to be finally useful and under our control, and we already see some positive outcome from this big data. It's not only a negative outcome all the time. This Cayman project, for example, is pretty much about open data, and what it undisclosed is really relevant, it's really important, and it's like changing all the regulation about finance, for example. And there are several cases, and WikiLeaks, after all, is big data, it's a leak of big data, and so there are total positive outcomes. It's just a new material that we don't know how to handle, I find. Yeah, but I am totally positive in that. And it's true that the new generation, they will know how to handle that in a better way, I think. I don't know if that answers.
And I would just add that I think that is not possible in any way, because we've, first of all, I mean, if we want to think in terms of a much longer term history, we've only ever exteriorized our lives, our thoughts, what we do. I think what's unique about this historical moment, the dossier, the ability to have a file on someone, the ability to collect information on somebody is not new. And even the ability for markets to gain greater intelligence about what we want, what we like, is not new. What is new, and this is why I suggested that we are becoming the object of exchange, is because by the very living of our lives, we generate information and data that can be taken and that lives very much an active life outside of us, yet is always being connected to us. And the fact of the matter is, we've never seen an historical moment where constituted power did not seek to have some control over information. I'm driven to think about these things in the way that I am because, frankly, I think that in many ways we live in a frightening historical moment because of the degree of the imbalance and because of the tools and the kind of the kinds of knowledge and techniques that are necessary in order to be able to work with this data is not beyond, specific groups. It's not widely available. So I couldn't agree with you more that it's precisely around questions of agency. And agency now is a material agency that entails particular, let's say, algorithmic practices or other kinds of big data practices. And from my perspective, it's not because I think data is so great. It's not because I think that, won't it be awesome that we can make all of these connections? It's because we're already living in this world, and we're very much on the wrong side of the divide. And I agree with you that in the arms race scenario, whether it's the NSA, I don't know. I'm more concerned in many ways about Google because I think they have better scientists, right? Or Facebook than the NSA.
They certainly pay them.
Yeah. So no, we're not going to catch up to that. But so what else is new? Like, when were we ever in a historical moment where there was this kind of level playing field that we existed on? I just think that it's a potentially a really powerful strategic tool.
But technologically, it is possible to create an opt-out of the data catchment system, or did I misunderstand that? I mean, it's not in everybody's economic interest, I can understand that, but theoretically it should be possible, right, to completely opt out?
It's not a technological issue. It's not a technological, strictly speaking. That's not what we're talking about.
So do I understand you correctly then that nobody's really done an awful lot of thinking about what would happen if we could opt out, if the option was given to us? It's not, what would the consequences be to our daily lives? That's what I'm after. Is this a marketing thing? Is this a governance issue?
So I guess I'd answer that in terms of sort of echoing Mark's point that we have an issue that touches on the technical, on the social, and on the regulatory. The person I'd point you to, whose work I think is really interesting in this regard, is Alessandro Acquisti. And what he does, he's a behavioral economist. He sets up experiments where he asks people, you have this piece of information about you. How much would it cost for you to trade that information with me? And what he finds is that, depressingly, people will give away extremely personal information for, a few cents on the dollar. So I think in those opt-out scenarios, what you're dealing with is with capitalist structures that will want to create bargaining systems or trading systems for data. And I think the problem with that is that we actually don't know the value of our data. I actually don't think data can be purely thought of in these sort of economic frameworks. And that certainly when we use these kind of longer temporal frames, we find out that data that we thought was kind of irrelevant, not actually that interesting 5 years ago, 50 years from now becomes incredibly instructive and perhaps incredibly valuable. So I think this is how I tend to think about this sort of conflation of different areas all happening at once when we try to think about how opt-out works. I also just want to quickly respond to Mark's comment about, yes, we've always been in the situation where we have less power, and how do we gain agency in these systems? I think this is a key question. I think we're absolutely on the same page. All I would ask is, who is we in this sentence? Is it those of us who go to elite schools, who have technical skills, who are generally pretty privileged in our lives? Or can it be everyone? Or are we just setting up a different kind of elite? Are we setting up an elite who have skills to code, have skills to analyze data? That's the thing that concerns me most. I mean, and I actually think there is a really optimistic future where we can think about these skills as being basic and having to be part of our training from a very early age. I think then we can talk about agency, and we have to think about it internationally. We can't just think about sort of the white Western global North. But we really are looking at a very large-scale problem. If we really want to try and inform everybody and get everybody those skills, I think that's actually really valuable. But we have to think much bigger than that just coming through elite universities and institutions.
I've sort of been thinking about this desire line, this path you showed before, and if you're a proponent of smart cities, you would say, well, this is exactly, this is a smart city, it can conform to everybody's behavior. So I think my question is that whether the real problem might have something to do with the fact that big data is, or seems to be diminishing the distance between this sort of planned city, this what Sato would call the strategic, and then the sort of more tactic desire lines, how we walk around in our daily lives, and if this is true, that this distance is diminishing, I'm wondering, is it like a semiotic war going on? Are we losing our meaning? Are we losing our narratives, or our ways of individually developing meaning within our everyday life, or would we perhaps develop other ways of leaving traces, but then making them mean nothing, or how do you look upon this?
This is a fantastic question, and I think you're right. I think there's a sense of exteriorization of subjectivity that's occurring with data traces, and I think Mark gave us some really good examples of how that's occurring and how that's shifting the idea of our own sort of subject position. But I like this idea, and this is where I kind of get really excited about what we can do, of leaving fake traces, of how traces can be generated in ways that actually don't reflect us in any real way. And here I think looking to data artists is actually incredibly productive. So I'm thinking about very, very early, this is sort of in the early 2000s, when people were designing basic browser plugins that you could use that would actually scoop everybody's search queries over the course of a week and mix in yours so that your search queries actually reflect a very different set of interests to your own. And then suddenly you become part of a very different group that's much harder to analyze. I also think of the work of artists like Julian Oliver, who did that fantastic work, Men in Grey, where you have two men in suits walking along with briefcases with mirrors on the side. And by using men in the middle attacks, you can actually reflect back people's screens to them as you walk through in public space. So, again, opening up that idea that your screen is not this private personal bubble that only you have access to. And again, I think Jake Applebaum last night showed us exactly why that idea has become so tenuous. So yeah, I actually think there are some really interesting people working on that very problem right now that I think we need to pay more attention to. I think that idea of how we can choose to disguise ourselves and how we choose to fall into shadow is actually really important and something that we have to fight for.
Okay, so I believe, unfortunately, we have to cut it short here, but I guess we're all going to be around, at least in here or in the hallways. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to you guys for sticking around and great questions. Thank you.
I don't know.